The crash of a broken bottle against the wall, the sharp stench of booze, a hoarse voice rising into a drunken shout. All of this was the usual backdrop of life for little Sam. At just 6 years old, he already knew what fear was. He had learned to freeze at the sound of his stepfather's footsteps, to hide behind furniture when the man entered the room, and to never ever meet his eyes. Sam's mother always said that his stepfather was just tired, that work had made him this angry. She asked Sam not to upset him, to stay out of his way. But Sam knew it didn't matter. Sometimes, just being in the same room was enough to unleash his stepfather's drunken rage in full force. That evening, Sam didn't have time to hide. His stepfather stormed into the room, stumbling, gripping a half-empty bottle in one hand. He was mumbling something about useless mouths to feed, about how he was wasting his money on a freeloader. Then, he grabbed Sam by the collar and yanked him off the ground. "You little brat, why were you even born?" he snarled, raising his fist. The first hit landed on Sam's shoulder, but the next ones were much worse. He didn't remember how he ended up on the floor. Pain flared in his head, his stomach, his chest. He didn't scream. He had learned long ago that screaming only made it worse. He woke up in a hospital. A white ceiling, the smell of antiseptics, muffled voices behind the door. His head throbbed, his body ached all over, but the worst part was something else. His mother wasn't there. Instead, a stern woman in a dark suit sat beside him. "You're not going back home, Sam," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "You're being taken somewhere safe." He didn't understand where they were taking him, but deep down, he already knew. His life was now divided into before and after. The orphanage wasn't a rescue. It was a place full of kids just like him, broken, guarded, abandoned. The older boys made one thing clear from day one: weakness wasn't tolerated here. Sam learned that lesson fast when a group of them cornered him in the hallway and shoved him to the ground. He didn't cry. He got up and hit back. After that, they respected him. Sam realized that in this world, no one was coming to save him. Kindness was weakness. If he wanted to survive, he had to be strong. And he swore to himself that he would never be a victim again. The orphanage taught Sam the most important rule of survival. You can't win alone. Everyone fended for themselves, but only a few figured out how to not just survive, but actually live. Sam understood early on that he couldn't do it alone, so he started looking for others who were willing to stand their ground like him. That's how his small group was formed. There were 5 of them. Roy, a street-smart daredevil who knew how to steal and outrun the cops. Jake, tall and quiet, but a man of his word. Marcus, a natural strategist, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Tommy, the youngest, but fearless to the point of recklessness. And Sam, their unspoken leader. They were different, but they had one thing in common. They refused to be victims anymore. They didn't expect help from the caretakers, the government, or the idea of a perfect foster home. They became a family, not by blood, but by shared pain and understanding. Together, they defended their ground, had each other's backs, and found ways to make life just a little more bearable. When someone tried to mess with one of them, all 5 responded. They didn't start fights, but they didn't back down from them either. Sam knew the world ran on strength, and the orphanage was just a smaller version of that world. "We need a place of our own," Marcus said one evening as they sat on the rooftop, away from the noise of the other kids. "What's wrong with your room?" Roy smirked, biting into a stolen piece of bread. "We need a space that's just ours, somewhere no one can touch us," Jake said seriously. They found it, a basement in the abandoned wing of the orphanage. The staff never went down there, and the other kids were too scared, whispering about shadows lurking in the dark. But for Sam and his crew, it became a sanctuary. They dragged in old mattresses, turned crates into makeshift tables, and even found a rusted barrel to burn newspapers on cold nights. This was their fortress. It was where they planned, trained, and made a pact, never to betray each other. Years passed quickly. The orphanage was their battlefield, their training ground. But eventually, they all had to leave. On graduation day, Sam watched as his brothers packed up their few belongings, uncertain about what waited beyond those gates. Most kids from the orphanage ended up nowhere. Dead-end jobs, crime, poverty. But Sam refused to let that be their fate. If they wanted a way out, they had to stick together. "We have a friend on the force," Roy said, flipping a police badge he had once been given by an officer he knew. "He might have some work for us." "Legal work?" Tommy asked. "Does it matter?" Jake smirked. Sam knew the choices they made now would shape their future. After a long silence, he finally said, "We start a business. Security. People always need protection." "You really think anyone's going to trust a bunch of ex-orphan kids to keep them safe?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "We'll earn their trust. Step by step," Sam said firmly. And so their agency was born. Small, unknown, but built on loyalty and grit. They weren't abandoned kids anymore. They were a brotherhood. And they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But they were ready. Years of hard work turned Sam's agency into a success. They took tough jobs, protected people the system failed, and built a reputation as men who could be counted on. But even with money in the bank and a future ahead, Sam felt an unfinished chapter in his life. He hadn't seen his mother since the night he was taken away. No letters, no calls, nothing. Just fading memories of a woman who had once loved him but had been too weak to protect him. One evening, after closing a tough case, he made a decision. He reached out to some contacts in the police and had them look into her whereabouts. The news wasn't good. She was in a state hospital, one of those places where people with no family or future ended up. When he arrived, the place reeked of bleach and despair. Peeling walls, tired nurses, lifeless stares from patients who had been forgotten by the world. And then, he saw her. She had aged. Her hair was gray, her face worn with deep lines, her eyes cloudy. But it was her, his mother. "Sam?" Her voice was weak, but there was hope in it. He couldn't speak. Too many emotions crashed over him. Anger, sorrow, love he had tried to bury. "I'm here," he finally said. He moved her to a private clinic, but the doctors warned him it was too late. She had been sick for too long. He didn't know what to feel. He had wanted to hate her for not saving him back then. But now, looking at this frail woman, he saw not an enemy, but a person who had made mistakes. He spent those last weeks by her side, listening to her stories, holding her hand, remembering how she used to sing him lullabies. But time wasn't on their side. One night, her heart stopped. The funeral was small, just him. He felt empty. But he knew he was free, he had forgiven, and he was ready to move forward. Months had passed since his mother's funeral, yet Sam still felt a strange emptiness inside. His friends kept him from shutting down completely, the agency was running smoothly, and life seemed to be back on track. But every time he visited his mother's grave, memories of the past would wash over him. The quiet cemetery, the rustling leaves underfoot, the damp scent of earth. It all reminded him of who he was and what he had endured. On one such visit, as he stood by the grave, the silence was broken by a barely audible sound, a child's sobbing. Sam froze, listening carefully. The sound seemed to come from a freshly dug grave nearby. Cautiously he approached and felt his chest tighten at the sight before him. A small boy, no older than 6, was sitting on the cold ground, trembling from the chill. He wore a thin jacket, dirty jeans, and sneakers with holes in the toes. Clutched tightly in his small hands was a worn-out stuffed animal. Sam knelt down beside him. "Hey kid, are you okay?" he asked gently. The boy flinched and looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Fear and despair stared back at Sam. "I don't want to go back," the boy whimpered. "Please don't make me go back." Sam felt something tighten in his gut. He knew that fear. He knew what it was like to dread going back to a place that felt more like a prison than a home. "Go back where?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "The orphanage." The boy's voice wavered. "They said my mom's gone, but I waited for her. I thought if I stayed here, she'd come back for me." Sam didn't know what to say. He wasn't the sentimental type, but this scene was too familiar. It was like looking at a version of himself from years ago, alone, scared, and forgotten. "What's your name?" he asked after a pause. "Tommy," the boy whispered. Sam nodded, took off his jacket, and draped it over Tommy's thin shoulders. "It's cold out here. Come on, let's get you something to eat. You hungry?" Tommy hesitated, then nodded. His lips were pale, and his hands shook from the cold. Sam reached for his hand. He didn't know what the next step was, but he knew one thing: he wasn't leaving this kid alone. A few days had passed since Sam brought Tommy home. He still wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe he just couldn't walk away and leave the kid out there. Deep down, he knew he had to at least give him a temporary safe place. The boy adjusted quickly. For the first time in who knew how long, he ate real meals, slept in a warm bed, and didn't wake up to shouting or a rough shove. Tommy was still cautious, but little by little, he started to open up. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, Tommy suddenly looked up from his plate. "You're a good person, Sam," he said softly. "It'd be nice if you were my dad." Sam froze. He didn't know how to respond. A flood of emotions hit him all at once, forcing him to remember his own childhood, the way he had wished for someone to take him away from his nightmare. "Tommy?" he started carefully. I don't know what to say." The boy sighed and looked down. "It's okay. I wish I had someone like you." Sam gripped his fork tighter. This was too personal. He had always seen himself as someone who protected others, helped them, but not as someone who could take on that kind of responsibility. Later that night, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Sam called his friends over. He told them everything, how he had found the boy, what he had said at dinner. He wasn't sure what kind of advice he was looking for. "You know, it's not such a crazy idea," Mark, his longtime friend and partner, said. "The kid's clearly attached to you, and you to him." "Me? Come on," Sam scoffed, though even he wasn't convinced by his own words. "Then why is he still here?" Mike, another friend, asked. "You could have called social services days ago, but you didn't. Why?" Sam had no answer. He glanced toward the bedroom where Tommy was sleeping. Something inside him had shifted, and that scared him. The process of applying for guardianship took months. Sam had expected challenges, but he hadn't realized just how grueling it would be. Every meeting with social workers, every document he had to sign, only made his anxiety grow. He never thought he'd be fighting to become someone's father. But now, he couldn't imagine walking away from Tommy. Every night, as Tommy slept in the next room, Sam would sit and think about how much things had changed. The boy needed him, and somehow, he needed the boy just as much. When the final papers were signed, Sam drove straight to the orphanage to pick Tommy up. His heart pounded. Joy, fear, and responsibility all tangled together. His life was about to change forever. He walked into the room and saw Tommy sitting on his bed, clutching his tattered stuffed animal. When the boy saw him, he froze, as if afraid to believe it was real. You came?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. Sam knelt down in front of him and held out his hands. "Of course I came, Tommy. I promised." The boy didn't move, his eyes full of doubt. They said you might change your mind. That sometimes people," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Sam exhaled deeply and took Tommy's small hands in his own. "Listen to me. No one is ever going to leave you again. You're my son now. You hear me? Mine." His voice cracked slightly, but he refused to let himself break. For a moment, Tommy just stared at him. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, wrapping his arms around Sam. "Dad," he whispered, burying his face in Sam's shoulder. Sam held him tight. He hadn't expected to hear that word, but somehow, it filled a part of him he hadn't even realized was empty. As they stepped out of the orphanage, Tommy still clung to his hand. The world outside was new to him, unfamiliar, but with Sam, he felt safe. "Where are we going now?" the boy asked, looking around the unfamiliar streets. Sam chuckled and ruffled his hair. "Home, Tommy. We're going home."